Now we are going to talk about patterns of inheritance, but we are going to do this in a two-part video, not because it's long, but because I want to post some questions regarding Gregor Mendel after the first part. No? Kay different sila sang second part, different sila topic. So, we have discussed the events that led to the development of a newborn, right? But what makes each newborn unique? The answer lies, of course, sa ilang DNA in the sperm and oocyte that combine to produce that first diploid cell, the human zygote. From genotype to phenotype, each human body cell has a full complement of DNA stored in 23 pairs of chromosomes, as you can see here. This shows a pair or the pairs in a systematic arrangement na nisa. This is called a karyotype. So karyotyping. Among this is one pair of chromosomes called the sex chromosome. No, as you can see there's a last ang X and Y that determines the sex of the individual. So it's either XX na da siya kung babae or XY if lalaki. The remaining 22 chromosome pairs are called the autosomal chromosomes. Each of these chromosomes carries hundreds or even thousands of genes, each of which may code na siya nga tawag for the assembly of a particular protein that is ang genes gina-express sang sininga mga proteins. An individual's complete genetic makeup is referred to as his or her genotype. The characteristics that the genes express, whether they are physical, behavioral, or biochemical, they are a person's phenotype naman. So, you inherit one chromosome in each pair, right? A full complement of 23 from the mother and the father. So, from each parent. This occurs when the sperm and oocyte combine at the moment of your conception. Homologous chromosome, those that make up ang complementary pair, they have genes for the same characteristics in the same location on that chromosome. Hence the term homo, no? Ang homologous chromosome. And because one copy of a gene, which is called the allele, is inherited from each parent, the alleles in these complementary pairs may vary. Take, for example, an allele that encodes for dimples. Halimbawa, a child may inherit the allele encoding for dimples on the chromosome from the father and the allele that encodes for smooth skin, meaning wala dimples, on the chromosome from the mother. Although a person can have two identical alleles for a single gene, or the homozygous state kay parehos, it is also possible for a person to have two different alleles or the heterozygous state. The two alleles can interact in several different ways. The expression of an allele can be dominant, which for the activity of this gene, it will mask the expression of the non-dominant. Hindi maggwa si non-dominant kung may dominant nga allele. So, anong tawag sa non-dominant? It's called the recessive allele. Sometimes, dominance is complete. At other times, it is incomplete. In both cases, or some cases, both alleles are expressed at the same time in the form of co-dominance. Okay? Dominant, recessive, both are dominant or co-dominance. In the simplest scenario, a single pair of genes will determine a single heritable characteristic. Okay, so this phenomenon, for example, sa multiple alleles, ang aton nga blood types, may ara kita nga blood type A, blood type B, or blood type O. So, for instance, may pagid 8 or more nga genes which their own alleles determine eye color sa humans. And pwede man nga may two corresponding alleles sa given gene, more than two alleles ang commonly exist sa population. So, over 100 years of theoretical and experimental genetic studies and the more recent nga sequencing nga ginatawag and annotation of the human genome, amo niyang mas naka-help sa scientists to develop a better understanding of how an individual's genotype is expressed as their phenotype. So, this body of knowledge can help scientists and medical professionals to predict or at least estimate some of the features that an offspring will inherit, anong mamana niya, by examining ang genotype or phenotype sang parents. So, why is it important to do this? One important application is ang ma-identify ang individual ang iyang risk for certain nga mga diseases or disorders which are genetic na mamana. However, most genetic diseases or most diseases have a multigenic pattern of inheritance and it can also be affected by the environment. So, examining the genotypes or phenotypes of a person's parents will provide only limited lang mga information about the risk of inheriting the disease. So, yeah, that's it. So, who is Gregor Mendel? In Mendel's theory of inheritance, our contemporary understanding of genetics, it rests on the works sang 19th century nga monghe. So, he is a monk. He worked mid 1800s, long before anyone knew about genes, chromosomes. So, Gregor Mendel, nag-discover siya that ang mga garden peas, they transmit their physical characteristics to subsequent generations in a discrete but predictable fashion. So, when he mated or gin-cross niya ang two pure breeding pea plant, they differed by certain characteristics. The first generation offspring all looked like one of the parents. For instance, when he crossed ang tall and dwarf nga pure breeding pea plants, all of the offspring were tall. So Mendel called the tallness the dominant gene. Kaya nga nag-occur siya because it was expressed in the offspring when it was present in the purebred parent. And then he called dwarfism ang recessive because it was masked in the offspring of the purebred parent possessed the dominant characteristic. Although nga purebred dwarf ang isa ka parent, since tall ang mga offspring nga nagwa, meaning ang dwarfism is recessive, hindi siya dominant. So, we should note that tallness and dwarfism are variations on the characteristic of height, right? So Mendel called this a variation ang ginatawag nga trait. So we know subong that these traits are expressions on different alleles. Nga gene siya nga gin-encode which is related to height. So Mendel performed thousands of crosses in pea plants with different traits for a variety of characteristics. And he repeatedly came up with the same results. Among the traits that he studied, one was always dominant and the other was always recessive. So we should remember that this dominant recessive relationship between alleles is not always the case. Sa pea plants lang niya ni Mendel. Some alleles are co-dominant and sometimes dominance is incomplete, right? So why are we talking about peas? Nga human anatomy and physiology maning ginastoryahan tarot, right? So you'll know later. because using Mendel's understanding of dominant and recessive traits, Mendel tested whether a recessive trait could be lost altogether in a lineage or whether it would resurface in a later generation. By crossing the second generation offspring of purebred parents with each other, he showed that ano man gid gali, ma-resurface gid man gali ang mga recessive trait nga wala nagluluwa sa first offspring. Nag-reappear sila liwat sa third generation. So, may ratio nga 3:1. Three offspring having the dominant trait and one having the recessive trait. Mendel then proposed that characteristics such as height were determined by heritable factors that were transmitted, one from each parent, of course, and inherited in pairs by the offspring. So makita nyo na sa next nga video on how it is done in paper. In the language of genetics, Mendel's theory applied to humans. No? Says that if an individual receives two dominant alleles, one from each parent, the individual's phenotype will express the dominant trait. And if an individual receives two recessive alleles, then, syempre, the recessive trait will be expressed kaya wala sang dominant trait. Ma-express siya sa phenotype. So, individuals who have two identical alleles for a given gene, whether dominant or recessive, are said to be homozygous. So, ginawag tanin ni Kagina, homo means same. Conversely, an individual who has one dominant allele and one recessive allele, it is said to be heterozygous. Ang term nga hetero, it means different. So, in this case, the dominant trait will be expressed and the individual will be phenotypically identical to an individual who possesses two dominant alleles for the trait. It is common practice in genetics also to use capital and lowercase letters you'll see later to represent ang dominant and recessive alleles. And using Mendel's pea plants as an example, uh, if a tall pea plant nga ginawag ta kagina homozygous, it will possess of course two tall alleles. So kung dominant, capital letters. So kung two tall alleles, so butang mo lang da big letter T and big letter T. Kay two dominant alleles. So for a dwarf pea plant naman must be homozygous because its dwarfism can only be expressed when two recessive alleles are present. Kung two recessive allele, meaning small letter T and small letter T. And ang heterozygous pea plant, may genes siya nga dala nga tall and short or tall and dwarf. So, one capital letter T and hindi S ha, hindi short or hindi D man nga dwarf, but small letter T. So, it would be tall and phenotypically indistinguishable from a tall homozygous pea plant because of the dominant tall allele. Kung makita mo siya, kung makita mo sila sang pure tall, no? May duwa ka dominant T and then versus the one capital T and one small letter T. Kung tanawon mo ang ila itsura, the same lang man. So, amo na sa ginatawag nga phenotype. Kung ano ang gina-express ya, kung ano ang makita naton sa iya. But, of course, hindi ta makita kung ano ang iya genotype unless we do these experiments nga itanawon tagid ang iya nga genes. So again, Mendel deduced that a 3:1 ratio of dominant to recessive would be produced by the random segregation of heritable factors or what we call the genes when crossing two heterozygous pea plants. In other words, for any given gene, parents are equally likely to pass down either one of their alleles to their offspring in a haploid gamete. And The result will be expressed in a dominant recessive pattern if both ang parents are heterozygous. No? Ang ilang trait. And because of the random segregation of gametes, the laws of chance and probability will come into play. Kay kinahanglan i-predict ang likelihood of a given phenotype. So, consider a cross between an individual with two dominant alleles for the trait AA and an individual with two recessive alleles for the same trait, which is AA nga small na siya. So, it seems simple enough. But the inheritance pattern, it gets interesting when the second generation nga ang revelang mga bata nga niho kung i-cross mo sila liwat. So, makita nyo ang mother ra sa babaw, which is heterozygous nga big letter A and small letter A. And then, si father amo man, big letter A and small letter A. So, do simple lang siya. Kay 3:1 lang man siya mo. So, dominant, phenotypically, butang tabi, ano ni siya? Eye color. So, kung A, it means black. Kung big letter A, it means black. Kung small letter A, it means not so black or let's say brown. Kaya wala siya sang gene nga pampa-black sang mata, no? So, butang pa brown or light gray, something like that. So, makita mo nga ang iya offspring here sa inside are may homozygous nga black eye nga ang iris black eye kag may heterozygous duha ka bilog nga black iris man, no? And isa ka homozygous recessive, which is may isa sila ka bata nga magwa nga different color ang eye. Okay? So, in this generation, 50% of each parent's gametes are the big letter A and the other 50% are the small letter A. By Mendel's principle of random segregation, the possible combinations of gametes that the offspring can receive are the following. Again, discussed ta. And because segregation and fertilization are random, we do not know kung diin nga sperm ang madaog nga makapenetrate sa egg, right? Because of millions of sperm, di ba? It is random. Each offspring has a 25% chance of receiving any of these combinations. Therefore, if an heterozygous nga A, big letter A or small letter A, gin-cross mo siya sa another heterozygous, big letter A kag small letter A, cross were performed 1,000 times, no? Para makuha ang ratio nga 3:1. Amo na ginubra ni Mendel, gin-cross siya 1,000 times. And approximately 25% gid ya nga offspring it would be ano gid ya, A or the homozygous big letter A. No? So 50%. And then ang ang big letter A and small letter A plus the small letter A kag big letter A kay depende kung sino una but since dominant siya ibutangin siya sa front kung kung magsulat, no? It is 25%. And then another 25% ang duwa ka homozygous recessive allele. And again, the genotypic ratio for the inheritance pattern is 1:2:1. But ang phenotypic ratio is 3:1. So nga ang genotypic ratio is 1:2:1 kay isa sa offspring, sa apat nga offspring, ang isa dira is homozygous dominant. No? Ari makita nyo sa center, two big letter A's. And then, 1:2:1. So, si 1 is the homozygous dominant. Ang 2 is si heterozygous dominant and ang 1 is si homozygous recessive. So 1 is to 2 is to 1. We are talking about genotype. But si phenotype, ano ang magwa, is 3 is to 1. Although nga may ang 25% is may big letter A kag small letter A, ang magwa sina gyapon 'di ba is ang dominant allele, right? So, whether two big letter A's or one big letter A and small letter A siya, the same lang man na sila gyapon magwa nga phenotype. Kung makita, tabala ma-observe naton ang offspring. And then, 25% sang offspring would be dira lang magwa ang recessive uh, phenotype. In the formation of gametes, it is equally likely that either one of the pair alleles from one parent will be passed on to the offspring. This figure follows the possible combination of alleles through two generations following a first generation cross sang homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. Going back sa aton nga illustration, and the recessive phenotype, which is masked in the second generation, has a 1 in 4 chance or 25% sang reappearing sa third generation. Mendel's observation of pea plants also include many crosses that involve multiple traits, as you can see here, which prompted him to formulate the principle of independent assortment. And the law states that the members of one pair of gene or the allele from a parent will sort independently from other pairs of genes during the formation of gametes. Applied to pea plants, that means that the alleles associated with the different traits of the plant, such as color, height, or seed type, they will sort independently of one another. And this holds true except when two alleles happen to be located to the close to one another on the same chromosome. And independent assortment provides for a great degree sang diversity in the offspring. That's why even though nga mag-utod ka mo, uh, hindi ka mo 100% nga similar sa itsura or what we call the phenotype. Mendelian genetics represents the fundamentals of inheritance. But there are two important qualifiers to consider when applying Mendel's findings to inheritance studies in humans. First, as we've already noted, not all genes are inherited in a dominant recessive pattern. Although all diploid individuals have two alleles for every gene, allele pair may interact to create several types of inheritance patterns, including ang ginatawag nga incomplete dominance and co-dominance, which we'll talk about sa part 2 sang video nga ni. And secondly, Mendel performs his studies using thousands of pea plants. He was able to identify a 3 is to 1 phenotypic ratio, right, in second generation offspring because his large sample size overcame the influence of variability resulting from chance. In contrast, of course, no human couple has ever had thousands of children. If we know that a man and woman are both heterozygous for a recessive genetic disorder, we would predict that 1 in every 4 of their children would be affected by the disease. In real life, however, the influence of chance could change that ratio significantly. For example, if a man and a woman are both heterozygous for cystic fibrosis, a recessive genetic disorder that is expressed only when the individual has two defective alleles, we would expect 1 in 4 of their children to have cystic fibrosis. But it is entirely possible for them to have 7 children, right? So none of whom is affected. May mo na nga case, wala gali sang affected, bis ka naka 7 na sila. Or, what if duwa lang bata nila and both are affected? For each individual child, the presence or absence of a single gene disorder depends on which alleles that child inherits from his or her parents. Because again, ang probability of chance. Okay? It's very random. Alright, so part 2 of this topic will be in a different video and we will talk about these cases.